Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're diving into something a lot of you have been asking about. This is a YouTube video by an immigration attorney, Jacob Sapoknik.
Yeah.
And it's about the January 2025 visa bulletin predictions.
Oh, exciting.
Yeah. So if you're interested in U.S. immigration trends, this is definitely the deep dive for you, especially if you're waiting on a visa yourself.
Right.
We're going to unpack some really interesting stuff about which categories are moving forward, which ones are stuck, and you know what it might mean for you.
Yeah. And I think what's really cool about this is we're not just looking at the raw numbers, right? We're also going to be able to look at what this attorney, who, presumably is an expert, what his predictions are and his analysis of what's going on kind of behind the scenes.
Exactly. It's one thing to see the dates move or not move on the visa bulletin, but it's another thing to understand why.
Right.
So before we get into all the little details, can you just walk us through what the visa bulletin even is?
Yeah.
Why is it such a big deal for people waiting for their green cards?
Yeah. The visa bulletin, it's essentially a monthly update from the U.S. Department of State that tells us when visas are available for different categories of employment-based and family-based green card applicants. So think of it like a giant traffic light.
Okay.
It's controlling the flow of immigrants based on where they're from and the type of visa they're applying for.
Okay. So it's not as simple as just applying and waiting your turn.
No.
There are these different categories and cutoff dates.
Yeah, because each visa category has a limited number of visas available every year.
Right.
And the demand often exceeds the supply.
Oh.
So that's where the visa bulletin comes in. It uses something called priority dates to determine who's next in line.
Got it.
Your priority date is usually the date your petition was filed. And you can only move forward with your green card application when your priority date becomes current, according to the visa bulletin.
So it's kind of like a waiting list?
Yeah, think of it like a waiting list.
Okay.
And the visa bulletin tells you where you are in that line.
Okay.
And what's cool about this attorney is he's giving us kind of his expert interpretation of what this particular visa bulletin could mean for people in different situations.
Oh, that's cool. So he mentions two important dates, right? Like final action date and days for filing. Can you just break those down for us? I think that's pretty crucial to understanding this whole thing.
Absolutely, it is crucial. So the final action date, that's the date when visas are actually available for applicants to get their green card. So if your priority date is earlier than the final action date for your category, you're good to go. You can move forward with the final steps.
Okay, so that's the date you're really watching for, if you're at the finish line.
Yes.
Okay. What about dates for filing?
So the dates for filing are a little bit earlier in the process.
Okay.
And these dates tell you when you're eligible to actually file your adjustment of status application.
Okay.
Which is basically the paperwork you submit to get your green card. So even if your priority date isn't current for final action yet, you might still be able to file your adjustment of status if your date for filing is current.
Oh, okay. So even if your priority date's not current, you might still be able to get the ball rolling.
Exactly.
So that's cool.
Yeah.
So getting into the video itself, he starts off by giving an overall assessment of the visa bulletin. What's his take? Is it good news, bad news? What's he saying?
I think he's cautiously optimistic.
Okay.
He uses the phrase slight movement to describe the employment-based categories overall.
Okay.
Which he contrasts with the lack of movement we saw in December. But he was really enthusiastic about the family-based categories, which saw more movement. And he attributes that to increased processing capacity at the National Visa Center.
Oh, okay. So that makes sense. If they're able to process cases more efficiently, then there should be more movement.
Right.
He also makes a distinction between, employment-based and family-based categories. Can you break those down for us? What are the key differences?
So employment-based categories are for people, as the name suggests, their green card applications are sponsored by their employers.
Okay.
So these are typically skilled workers, professionals, investors, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Family-based categories are for people who are sponsored by family members, who are U.S. citizens or lawful permanent residents.
Okay, so it's all about who's sponsoring you, basically.
Yeah.
Employer versus family.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And each of these main categories are further divided?
Yes.
To subcategories?
Yeah,
So
that's right.
With their own specific requirements.
Yes, and quotas.
So that's why it looks so complicated, this whole bullet.
Exactly. It's like this big matrix of dates and categories.
Okay, well, let's break down each one of the categories. Let's start with employment-based.
Okay.
What are some of the highlights there?
Well, he highlights some really interesting movement in the EB2 category, which is for professionals holding advanced degrees or people with exceptional ability.
Okay.
So, for example, EB2 India saw an advancement of 2 months.
Wow.
EB2 China moved forward 1 month.
Yeah.
And for everybody else in EB2, there's a 2-week advancement.
Okay. And he seems to think this is a positive sign. He even suggests that we might see more movement in February and March?
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think it's possible, especially if his theory about, like, increased visa numbers holds true.
Okay.
But, we have to say that these are just predictions, right?
Right.
The actual visa bulletin for those months could look totally different.
You never know.
Yeah.
What about EB3?
Oh, EB3.
Right. He didn't seem as optimistic about that one.
No, he did not. He had some pretty blunt words for folks in EB3.
Oh, no.
Particularly those in the other workers subcategory.
Oh, okay.
He straight up said it's going to be a very bad year in 2025 for this category. And even suggested that people consider alternative strategies like filing a new application in a different category if they can.
Wow. That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
Like, what's his reasoning behind that? Is it just because, like, this bulletin didn't show much movement?
Right.
Or is there something else going on?
He didn't go into a ton of detail in this video.
Okay.
But I'm guessing it's based on a combination of things.
Yeah.
Like historical trends, the current backlogs, and any potential policy changes.
Right.
EB3 has always been notoriously slow-moving, especially for some countries like India and China.
Got it.
And I think he's just anticipating that trend is going to continue and maybe even get worse.
So, like, for those people who are stuck in that EB3, other workers, they really need to brace themselves.
Yeah. And it really highlights a crucial point, I think, for anyone following the visa bulletin, right?
Yeah.
You really need to pay attention to your specific category and your country of origin,
Yeah.
Like, the overall trends might be positive.
Right.
But the details can be very different depending on your situation.
And that's where having, like, an expert break things down,
right,
like this attorney, is so valuable.
Yeah.
It's not just seeing the numbers, but understanding, like, what it means for you.
Absolutely.
He also mentioned that the dates for filing for employment-based categories stayed the same this month. What does that mean? Should we be worried?
I wouldn't say worried, but it suggests that the earlier stages of the process aren't moving as quickly as we might have hoped.
Okay.
And he actually predicts that this trend's probably going to continue into February.
So even if your priority date is current, you might still have to wait to file.
Yeah, exactly. It's a reminder that the visa process is a long and winding road. There can be bottlenecks at different stages.
Oh, boy. Well, let's switch gears and talk about family-based categories.
Okay.
He seems much more positive about those.
And much more positive.
What were some of the highlights there?
Well, he was really excited about the dates for filing for certain family-based categories. For example, F2B Mexico, that's unmarried sons and daughters of permanent residents from Mexico.
Okay.
They jumped 3 months.
Wow.
And F3, for everybody else, married sons and daughters of U.S. citizens, also saw a 3-month advancement.
3 months. That's huge.
Yeah.
So for people in those categories, that's got to be good news.
Oh, absolutely. It means they can take that next step.
Yeah.
And get the process rolling. And even though this is just the date for filing, it still gives them that sense of progress.
Yeah, like a light at the end of the tunnel.
Exactly.
Even if the tunnel is still pretty long.
Yes.
What about the other family-based categories?
Yeah, he highlighted a couple others.
Okay.
F4, brothers and sisters of U.S. citizens, saw some movement as well.
Okay.
A 5-month advancement for all countries, and a 2-week advancement specifically for India.
Okay.
And even F1, unmarried sons and daughters of U.S. citizens, which he initially predicted would have no movement. Actually, there was a little bit of movement.
Oh, wow.
Which he was surprised.
Wow. So there's some positive momentum, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Across the board for family-based categories.
It seems that way.
And he attributes this to that increased processing capacity at the NVC.
Yes, at least in part. I think he really believes that the government's efforts to streamline the process, including, like you said, hiring more contractors. That's starting to pay off.
So is he saying that we can expect this trend to continue? Like, is it going to keep going up?
I think he thinks so. In fact, he predicts after spring 2025, we'll see even more movement and interview scheduling thanks to this increased processing capacity.
Okay. So that's encouraging for anyone stuck in that backlog.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be a deep dive if there weren't, like, potential challenges.
Right.
Right.
Exactly.
Did he mention anything that could, like, throw a wrench in the works?
He did.
Oh, no. What is it?
He warns that there might be some delays in the first part of the year due to the incoming new administration.
Oh, yeah. The classic political wild card.
Yes.
It makes sense that a transition could lead to some hiccups.
Right. Exactly. He doesn't get into specifics about what those delays might look like.
Okay.
But it's something to keep in mind if you're waiting for action on your case.
So it's kind of like hurry up and wait. Like they're speeding up the processing.
Right.
But then there's this potential slowdown.
Right.
It's got to be frustrating for people who are, like, trying to plan their lives.
Absolutely. And that frustration is, like, palpable in his call to action at the end of the video. You know, he urges listeners to be proactive, prepare their cases really thoroughly, and even sue them if necessary.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's strong.
It's a strong statement.
Yeah.
But, you know, it just really highlights how important it is to be your own advocate in this process.
Yeah. It's easy to feel powerless, I think, with all this.
Absolutely.
But remembering that you do have options
can
make a big difference.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up this part, you mentioned earlier the importance of looking, like, beyond the numbers.
Yes.
On a visa bulletin, like historical trends and policy changes.
Yes.
Why do those things matter when we're trying to understand this particular bulletin?
It's all about context.
Okay.
Seeing where things have been in the past can give us a clue about where they might be going in the future. Okay. So, for example, you know, if a particular category has historically had a lot of retrogression, that's a red flag.
Retrogression, meaning like it went backwards?
Exactly. The priority dates actually moved backward.
Oh, wow.
So visas became unavailable,
whoa.
Even for people whose priority dates were previously current.
So you move back in the line.
Yeah, you're like taking a step back.
Yeah.
After moving forward.
Ugh.
Yeah.
What causes that?
Yeah.
Is it just, like, random chaos?
It's not exactly random, but it can feel that way. I think one of the biggest drivers is just the fact that, you know, there's a limited number of visas available each year.
Right.
Each category has a quota.
Yeah.
And when demand exceeds supply, we get these backlogs and these retrogressions.
So it's like musical chairs with visas instead of chairs.
Exactly.
And then, to make it more complicated, there are country limits, too.
Yes.
Oh, my God.
So certain countries like India and China, they have a really high volume of applicants.
Right.
So that leads to longer wait times and more of those retrogressions.
So for someone from India applying an EB-3, this history of retrogression just makes that prediction of a very bad year even worse.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean he's wrong.
Right.
But it suggests that anyone in that situation should be prepared for, you know, potentially a very bumpy ride.
Okay. So we've got historical trends. You also mentioned policy changes.
Yes.
Can you give us an example of how those could impact the visa bulletin?
Sure. Let's say, hypothetically, the government decides to increase the number of visas available for employment-based categories.
Okay.
You know, that would likely mean we'd see more movement in the visa bulletin.
Right.
Priority dates could advance quicker.
That'd be good news for people waiting in those lines.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It could shave years off their wait time. On the other hand, if there's a policy change that makes it harder to qualify for a visa, or, you know, if there's some kind of, you know, effort to restrict immigration, that could have the opposite effect, you know, slow things down, maybe even lead to more of that retrogression.
So it's not just about the numbers and the dates. The whole system is influenced by, like, bigger decisions.
Right, exactly. And those decisions are subject to change, depending on, you know, who's in power and what their priorities are.
Yeah. That's why it can feel like trying to hit a moving target.
Yeah, absolutely.
It must be so stressful.
Yeah.
For people who are trying to, like, plan their lives.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. It's like building a house on shifting sand.
Oh, wow.
You just never know if the ground's going to stay stable.
So patience and, like, flexibility are key, it sounds like.
I would say so, yes. But I think also knowledge is really important too.
Right.
The more you know about how the system works
Yeah.
and what factors can influence it, the better equipped you are to make good decisions.
And advocate for yourself.
Exactly.
So this attorney's video is coming in handy. He's kind of giving us that behind-the-scenes look.
Yeah. He's explaining not just what's happening, but why it's happening and what it could mean,
Yeah.
in the future.
And by combining his insights with our, understanding of the historical trends and the policy changes, I think we can get a clearer picture
Absolutely.
of what's going on.
Yeah.
Speaking of his insights, let's get back to his advice.
Sure.
For people at different stages in the process, we talked about final action date and dates for filing. He goes on to give some really specific advice based on whether you're at the USCIS stage or the NVC stage or the embassy stage.
Right.
So can you kind of walk us through those stages and maybe some key takeaways
Sure.
from his advice?
Okay, let's start with the USCIS stage,
Okay.
which is usually the first step.
Okay.
This is where you're filing your petitions or your applications
Okay.
with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services.
So for someone who's brand new to this whole process, what's the most important thing to know?
He really emphasizes the importance of submitting a complete and error-free application.
Okay.
He warns against triggering what's called a request for evidence or an RFE. Okay.
Which can really delay the processing time.
Oh, okay. So attention to detail is key.
Oh, yes. At this stage.
Like cutting corners.
Exactly. He says, dot your I's, cross your T's, make sure everything is in order before you hit submit.
Got it.
So then once you've cleared that USCIS hurdle,
what's next?
The next stage is usually the National Visa Center, or the NVC.
Got it.
And that's where the processing is handled. After USCIS has approved the petition, his advice at this stage is to be documentarily complete as quickly as possible.
Documentarily complete? What does that even mean?
That just means submitting all of the required documents promptly. Financial documents, civil documents, supporting evidence. The NBC needs to have everything they need to move your case forward.
Right. So it's like getting all your ducks in a row so there are no holdups.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And they're relying on contractors now, right?
Yeah. So efficiency is really key.
Okay. You don't want to get lost in the shuffle.
Exactly.
Okay. So you've submitted your documents. You're documentarily complete. You're patiently waiting. What's the last stage?
The final stage is the embassy stage.
Okay.
This is when things get real because it usually involves the interview. And the final decision on your application.
So this is the home stretch.
Yeah, this is it.
What's the advice here?
Well, his advice is twofold. First, be proactive in following up with the embassy. To make sure your case is moving forward.
Okay, so it's okay to give them a little nudge.
Within reason, of course. You don't want to be calling them every day.
Right.
But, it's okay to check in periodically. Make sure things are on track.
What was the second part?
The second part of his advice was to consider moving your case to a different embassy or consulate if you're facing really long delays at your current one.
Okay, so it's like finding a faster lane in traffic.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Of course, it's not always that simple.
Right.
But it's an option worth thinking about if you're facing those crazy delays.
So even at this late stage, there still might be some things you can do to speed things up.
Right. It comes back to that theme of being proactive and understanding the system.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So to recap, we have those three main stages: USCIS, NVC, and embassy.
Right.
And at each stage, there are specific things you can do to make sure your case is moving forward.
Yeah, and while his advice provides a good roadmap, it's really important to remember this is just a general overview.
Right.
Everyone's case is unique.
Yeah.
And it's always best to consult with an experienced immigration attorney who can really give you that personalized guidance.
It's like having a Sherpa, guiding you up a mountain.
Exactly.
They know the terrain, they know the challenges, and they can help you get to the summit.
That's a perfect analogy. Speaking of reaching the summit.
Yes.
We've covered a lot of ground here.
I have.
We've talked about the predictions. Yeah.
We've talked about historical trends, and we've talked about his specific advice.
Yeah, but there's still one piece missing, right?
There is.
That warning about the delays.
Yes.
Because of the new administration.
It's the political wild card.
So To understand what this all means, I guess we need to talk about like the political landscape.
Yeah.
And try to figure out how this new administration might impact things.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, we're going to do that in the next part.
We are.
We're going to dive into the political side of things.
That sounds good.
And try to make sense of what it all means for, the people who are waiting in line.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Okay, so we've got these predictions about what the January 2025 visa bulletin could mean for different categories. But to really understand what those predictions mean for UA, we need to look back a little bit, like historically.
Okay, so let's do some time traveling then. You mentioned that some categories like EB3 have been like more volatile than others. What does that look like in practice?
Imagine a roller coaster.
With all its ups and downs.
Okay.
That's what some of these visa categories have been like. You might see like a big jump forward one month, only to be followed by like a really frustrating retrogression the next month.
Retrogression? That doesn't sound good.
It's not. Retrogression means the priority dates actually move backward.
Oh, wow.
So visas become unavailable, even for people whose priority dates were previously current.
So like you're moving forward in line and then like all of a sudden you have to move back.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's got to be so disheartening.
It is.
For people. What causes that? Like, is it just random chaos or is there like a reason?
I wouldn't say it's random.
Okay.
But it can definitely feel that way.
Yeah.
I think one of the main things that causes it is just the fact that there are a limited number of visas each year.
Right.
Every category has a quota.
Right.
And when the demand is higher than the supply, that's when we get these backlogs and retrogressions.
So it is literally like musical chairs, but with visas. Oh, man.
Okay. Yeah. And to complicate things even more, there are also per country limits.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So certain countries, like India and China, for example, they have a ton of applicants. So that leads to longer wait times and more frequent retrogressions.
So for someone from India applying an EB3, this history of retrogression just adds like another layer of uncertainty to that prediction of a very bad year.
Exactly. Doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong.
Right.
But it just means that anyone in that situation needs to be prepared.
Okay. So we've got these historical trends going on, but you also mentioned policy changes as like another factor.
Right.
Can you give us an example of how a policy change could impact the visa bulletin?
Sure. Let's say, hypothetically, the government decides to increase the number of visas available for employment-based categories.
Okay.
We'd likely see more movement on the visa bulletin, and priority dates could advance more quickly.
So that would be good news.
Yeah.
For those people. Okay.
It could potentially shave years off their wait time. On the flip side, if there's a policy change that makes it harder to qualify for a visa, or if there's a move to restrict immigration from certain countries, that could have the opposite effect, you know?
Yeah.
Slow things down, maybe lead to more retrogression.
It's not just about the numbers. The whole system is influenced by like these political decisions.
Right, and those decisions can change depending on who's in power
Yeah.
and what their priorities are.
Okay, so it's like, yeah, hitting a moving target.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It's going to be really stressful for people.
It is. It's like trying to, I don't know, like build a house on shifting sand.
You never know what's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. You never know if that ground is going to stay stable.
So patience and flexibility are key, it sounds like.
Definitely. But also knowledge, I think, is really important.
Okay.
The more you understand how the system works and what can influence it, the better you'll be able to make decisions.
Yeah.
And advocate for yourself.
And that's where, this attorney's video is helpful.
Right.
It's like a kind of a behind-the-scenes look at,
Yeah, he's explaining what's happening and why it's happening.
Yeah.
And what it could mean for the future.
And by combining, what he's saying with like our understanding of the trends and the potential changes, I think we can start to get a fuller picture.
Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Speaking of the attorney's insights, let's get back to his specific advice for people, kind of depending on where they are in the process.
Sure.
We've talked about final action date and dates for filing.
Uh-huh.
He goes on to give some advice based on if you're at the USCIS stage, NVC, or embassy stage.
Right.
Can you walk us through those stages and maybe some key takeaways?
Okay, so let's start with USCIS, which is, usually the first step in the process.
Right.
This is where you initially file your petitions or applications
Okay.
with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services.
So for someone who's just starting out, like what's What's the most important advice?
He really emphasizes submitting a complete and error-free application.
Okay.
He warns against triggering what's called a request for evidence, or an RFE, which can really slow down the processing time.
Okay, so no mistakes, basically.
Dot your I's and cross your T's, like he says.
Make sure everything is in order.
I got it.
So once you've cleared that USCIS hurdle...
The next step is usually the National Visa Center.
Okay.
Or NVC.
Okay.
That's where the processing is handled after USCIS has approved the petition.
Got it.
And his advice at this stage is to be documentarily complete.
Documentarily complete? What does that even mean?
It just means submitting all the required financial documents, your civil documents, supporting evidence, all promptly.
Okay.
The NVC needs everything to be able to process your case smoothly.
So it's like get everything in order so there are no holdups.
Yeah, exactly. And remember, they're relying heavily on contractors now to handle all the cases, so efficiency is really important.
Yeah. You don't want your case to get lost in the shuffle.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so you've submitted all your documents to the NVC. You're documentarily complete, and you're waiting patiently. What's the final stage?
The final stage is the embassy stage.
Okay.
And this is when things get really real because it involves, the interview and the final decision on your application.
Okay. So this is like the home stretch. What's the game plan here?
So his advice at this stage is twofold. First, you got to be proactive. You got to follow up with the embassy. Make sure that your case is moving forward. Don't just sit back and wait.
This is okay to give them a nudge.
Yeah, within reason.
Yeah.
You don't want to be calling every day.
Right.
But it's totally acceptable to check in.
Okay.
And make sure things are on track.
Okay.
The second part of his advice is to consider moving your case to a different embassy or consulate if you're facing really significant delays at your current post.
Okay.
Sometimes certain embassies have much longer processing times than others.
So it's like finding a faster lane in traffic.
Yeah.
If one is backed up, switch lanes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Of course, it's not always that easy.
Right.
You have to consider if you're willing to travel to a different location for the interview. But if you're facing those delays, it's an option.
So even at this late stage, there might still be things you can do.
Yeah. It's all about understanding the system.
Right. To speed things up.
Being proactive, right, and being, informed.
Okay, so to recap, we have those three main stages: USCIS, NVC, and embassy.
Yes.
And at each stage, there are specific things you can do to keep your case moving.
Well, his advice is great, and it's a good roadmap.
Yeah.
It's really important to remember that everyone's case is different.
Right.
And it's always a good idea to consult with an immigration attorney who can give you personalized advice.
It's, again, like having that Sherpa.
Yes.
Guiding you up the mountain.
Speaking of reaching the summit, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We talked about predictions, we talked about historical trends, we talked about advice.
Yeah. But there's still one piece missing, right?
Yeah.
That warning about delays.
Yes.
Because of the new administration.
The political wild card.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. So I guess to understand what this all means, we need to talk about the political landscape.
Yes.
And how this new administration might impact things.
Exactly. We can't just analyze trends and look at the visa bulletin in a vacuum.
Right.
We have to consider those outside forces.
Okay. Well, I guess that's what we're going to do in the last part of this deep dive.
That's what we're going to do.
We're going to explore those political threads that are kind of woven into this whole immigration system. All right, so we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really digging into the January 2025 visa bulletin predictions. We talked about the different categories, the historical trends, all the attorney's advice. But there's another layer we got to look at, the political layer.
Right, exactly. We can't really talk about the future of the visa bulletin without thinking about the politics.
Yeah, it's like trying to predict the weather, but you're not paying attention to, the wind.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about that wind, the incoming new administration. He mentions in the video that there could be some delays early in 2025 because of that transition. What kind of delays are we talking? And, what makes him think that this new administration might change things?
Well, we have to remember that immigration is a really, really political issue, and different administrations have different priorities.
Right.
Different approaches.
So even if, the current administration is making progress on, streamlining things, like we talked about with those contractors, those efforts could be, stalled or even reversed under a new administration.
Yeah, it's totally possible. Transitions can be really disruptive.
Right.
And it often takes a while for a new administration to figure things out and start implementing their agenda.
Does he give us any, specific clues about what this new administration's stance might be? Did he mention any policies or proposals or anything?
He doesn't really get into specifics in this video.
Okay.
But he does use that phrase, sue them, when he's talking about the potential delays.
Yeah.
So to me, that suggests that he thinks this new administration might not be so immigrant-friendly.
That's a pretty bold statement, even for a lawyer.
It is.
So it sounds like he's encouraging people to, be ready to fight if things take a turn for the worse.
Yeah, I think that's a fair interpretation. Be prepared, be informed, and if you need to, be ready to challenge policies that are unfair or unreasonable.
Yeah, that's good advice. And it makes me think that, having a lawyer through this whole process is super important.
Oh, absolutely.
But even, beyond the legal stuff, just staying informed about, what's going on politically is going to be key.
Yeah, it's like checking the news to see if a hurricane is coming. You might not be able to control the hurricane, but you can prepare for it.
Right.
Try to minimize the impact.
So we've got this potential for delays and, policy shifts, in early 2025.
Yeah.
But he also seems, kind of optimistic about the long-term outlook. He predicts that after spring 2025, we'll see even more movement. And he talks about the interview scheduling and, the processing capacity. Does he say anything about what might drive that positive change?
He doesn't say specifically, but I'm assuming he's thinking that, once the new administration settles in, things will get back to, a more normal pace.
Okay.
He's probably also thinking about the natural ups and downs of visa demand. Sometimes you have these huge surges in applications, and that can create big backlogs.
Mm-hmm.
And then sometimes things slow down and the system can catch up.
So it's a bunch of, different factors.
Right.
It's not just one thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's really complicated, and it's all these different things interacting, so it's hard to predict with any certainty.
Well, this has definitely been interesting.
Yes.
We started with just looking at, this attorney's predictions. Mm-hmm. And we've, gone down this rabbit hole of, historical trends and policy changes and, a new administration is coming in. I didn't realize it was so interconnected.
Yeah, it really highlights the fact that, navigating the immigration system isn't just about, filling out forms.
Yeah.
You really have to understand how the system works. And it's constantly changing.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one big takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they process all this info?
I think the most important thing is to be proactive and informed and adaptable.
Okay.
Don't just sit around waiting for things to happen. Stay updated on the latest news. Find yourself a good lawyer and be ready to change your plans if you need to.
So it's like sailing a ship. Through uncharted waters. Yeah. You gotta have a good map, a good captain, and you gotta be ready to change direction when the wind changes.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, even though the journey might be long and uncertain, there's a destination out there.
Well said. Well, on that note of hope, we're gonna wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it, helpful. And until next time, keep exploring and keep diving deep.